By 7:30 that morning, the old diesel had already defeated 3 men. The tractor sat beneath the open side of a weathered machine shed, its faded red hood carrying 40 years of scratches, sun bleaching, and grease-dark fingerprints. Overnight rain still clung to the rear tires. Beneath it, the concrete was spotted with oil stains, so old nobody remembered which machine had made them. Evan Mercer turned the key again. The starter engaged. The engine rolled over, heavy but steady. No ignition, no cough, not even the brief stumble of a cylinder trying to fire. Evan released the key. Silence returned to the shed. "Battery's not the problem," said Tyler, the younger mechanic leaning over the open hood. "It's spinning fast enough." He was right. They had installed a fully charged battery before breakfast. The terminals were clean. The starter had already been checked. There was diesel in the tank, and fuel had reached the system. Yet the engine refused to start. The tractor was an old mechanical diesel, built before farm machines came covered in electronic sensors and diagnostic ports. For decades, it had pulled wagons, dragged discs through spring ground, powered a grain auger, and spent long summer days moving hay. Then, 6 months earlier, Ewan had parked it. Yesterday, he needed it again. It never woke up. Tyler checked the fuel line once more. "Try it." Evan turned the key. Ruh. Nothing. Tyler frowned. They had already worked through the obvious possibilities. Weak battery, bad connection, restricted fuel, air in the line, starter trouble. Each possibility had produced another check. Each check had led them back to the same sound. The engine turned. It simply would not run. Tyler wiped his hands on a rag. "At some point, we're going to have to decide how much money you want buried in this thing." Evan looked at the tractor. That was the problem. On paper, Tyler's argument made sense. A major repair could cost more than the machine was worth. Evan had another tractor, newer, stronger, easier to find parts for, but this one had belonged to his father. Before that, his grandfather had used it. So Evan tried the key one more time. Near the shed entrance, Walter Hale raised his head. Nobody had asked the 73-year-old farmer to diagnose anything. He had come over that morning to return a hydraulic fitting Evan had lent him. For the last 20 minutes, Walter had barely spoken. He hadn't leaned beneath the hood, hadn't asked what parts they had replaced, hadn't offered one of those stories older farmers sometimes told about how they fixed a machine 30 years ago with fencing wire and a pocket knife. He had simply stood near the doorway, listening. Tyler pulled himself out from beside the engine. "I'd stop cranking it," he said. "We're not learning anything doing that." Walter's eyes remained on the tractor. Once more, Tyler glanced toward him. "What?" Walter walked a few steps closer. "Crank it again." Evan hesitated, then reached for the key. Tyler stepped back. The starter engaged. Zrrr. Walter lifted one finger. His hand moved almost imperceptibly with the rhythm. Once, twice, 3 times. Then his finger stopped. Again. Evan cranked it. Walter closed his eyes. This time, everyone watched him instead of the tractor. 4 seconds later, Walter opened them. "Stop." The shed went quiet. Tyler folded his arms. "You hearing something?" Walter didn't answer immediately. He walked toward the engine, placed one weathered hand against the side of the hood, and looked at Evan. "Has it sounded like that every time?" "As far as I can tell." Walter nodded slowly. Then he said something that made Tyler's expression change. "That's not what I asked." Walter looked back toward the engine. For everyone else, the tractor had made the same useless noise it had been making all morning. A starter turning an engine that refused to fire. Walter had heard something else. Not a knock, not a squeal, not a grinding bearing. Something smaller, something hidden inside the rhythm itself. He tapped the hood once. "Don't take anything apart yet." Tyler frowned. "Why?" Walter looked toward the ignition key. "Because that engine just told you where to start looking." Walter Hale had been listening to diesel engines for nearly 50 years. Not professionally, not with a stethoscope, and certainly not because he believed an old farmer's ears were better than a mechanic's instruments. He listened because, for most of his life, listening had been free. Walter bought his first tractor when he was 26. It was already 15 years old. It burned oil, leaked from 2 places, and started badly enough that the previous owner was happy to see it leave. Walter paid cash because it was the only tractor he could afford. 2 weeks later, it died at the far end of a field. There was no service truck coming, no diagnostic scanner, no screen displaying a fault code. Just Walter, a toolbox, and a machine that had stopped working. So he learned the oldest form of diagnosis, pay attention. A starter that dragged sounded different from one turning an engine normally. A weak cylinder changed a rhythm. A bearing beginning to fail didn't always announce itself with a knock. Sometimes the first warning was only a sound that hadn't been there yesterday. Walter learned to watch exhaust, to smell it, to notice how an engine behaved cold compared with warm, but mostly, he learned what normal sounded like. That part took years. Thousands of ordinary starts before sunrise. Thousands of hours under load. Engines pulling uphill. Engines idling beside barns. Diesels working through August heat. Cold January mornings, when the oil seemed thick enough to slow everything inside the block. None of those moments felt like training. But they were. Every healthy start gave Walter another example of normal. And eventually, normal became something he could recognize without thinking. Which meant abnormal had somewhere to stand out. But experience had also taught Walter something more important. Hearing something wrong didn't mean knowing what was wrong. He had learned that lesson at 34. An old diesel developed a knock under load. Walter listened to it for 2 days and became convinced he knew the cause. He ordered parts he couldn't afford, tore into the engine, replaced them, put everything back together, then started the tractor. The knock was still there. Walter remembered standing beside that engine feeling sick. The money hurt. The embarrassment hurt more. He had made the mistake inexperienced men made, and experienced men sometimes made even faster. He had fallen in love with his first answer. After that, Walter made himself a rule. Don't repair your guess. Test it first. Nearly 40 years later, that rule was why he hadn't touched Evan's tractor. Not yet. Tyler stood beside the open hood. So what did you hear? Walter looked at the engine. Something different. Different how? The rhythm. Tyler waited. Walter said nothing more. You just told us the engine showed you where to start looking? Walter nodded. Where to look isn't the same as what to replace. Tyler gave a short breath through his nose. Not quite a laugh. Not quite irritation. Walter understood. Tyler had formal training. Walter never received. He knew specifications, test procedures, and equipment. Walter would have considered extraordinary when he was young. Walter respected that. This wasn't old knowledge, fighting new knowledge. The machine didn't care which generation fixed it. But Tyler had learned in a world where instruments could quickly give numbers to problems. Walter had learned on machines that gave you almost nothing. Before you measured, you had to notice. Evan leaned against the fender. You've worked on this model before? No. Same engine? No. Tyler looked at him. Then how can you recognize the sound? Walter turned toward the tractor. I'm not listening for the model. That quieted both men. He pointed toward the starter. When an engine turns over, it has a pattern. Then toward the block. Different engine. Different, exact sound. But the work happening inside still repeats. Compression. Resistance. Rotation. One event following another. Walter wasn't claiming he could hear a bad valve through cast iron. He couldn't. He wasn't claiming he knew which part had failed. He didn't. All he knew was that one part of the cranking rhythm did not seem to match the others. And that was enough to earn a closer look. Tyler folded his arms. So what do you want to test? Walter looked toward the driver's seat. Nothing yet. Tyler frowned. Walter pointed toward the exhaust stack. First, I want you to hear it. We've cranked it 6 times. I know. What's one more going to tell us? Walter looked at him. That depends on whether you listen to the engine or wait for it to start. Tyler's arms slowly unfolded. Walter turned to Evan. Get in. Evan climbed into the seat. His hand reached toward the key. Walter stopped him. Wait. Then he positioned Tyler beside the engine. Don't look at me this time. Tyler glanced toward the old farmer. Where do I look? The tractor. Walter pointed first toward the exhaust. Watch that. Then toward the engine. And listen to the crank. For what? Walter paused. He could have described what he thought he heard. But that would plant the answer in Tyler's head. Walter didn't want Tyler listening for Walter's suspicion. He wanted him listening for a difference. The part that doesn't sound like the others? Evan's fingers closed around the key. For the first time that morning, nobody was trying to start the tractor. They were asking it a question. And Walter had learned long ago that an old machine could tell you a great deal if you stopped deciding what it was going to say before you listened. Evan turned the key. The starter pulled the engine over. Walter raised his hand. Stop. This time, nobody spoke. Walter stepped closer to the tractor and looked at the exhaust stack. Again. 3 seconds. Evan cranked it. Walter counted silently with his fingers. Tyler listened too. But all he heard was what he had heard all morning. A starter working against a diesel engine that refused to fire. Walter pointed toward the exhaust. What did you see? Tyler looked at it. Nothing. Exactly. Tyler frowned. Walter wasn't ready to explain. Again. The starter engaged for the third time. Walter lowered his head slightly, shutting out everything except the cadence. Most people heard one continuous mechanical sound. Walter separated it into pulses. Every time the crankshaft turned, the pistons moved through their strokes. As each cylinder approached compression, the starter had to push against resistance. On a healthy engine, those repeating loads contributed to a recognizable cadence. Walter wasn't measuring compression with his ears. He knew better than that. But he could hear enough to know the rhythm deserved investigation. Rar. There. A subtle unevenness. Not a metallic knock. Not grinding. Not the slow labor of a dying battery. The engine was turning strongly, but the pattern wasn't as uniform as Walter expected. Stop. Evan released the key. Tyler stared at him. You think it's got a weak cylinder? Walter wiped a thumb across the edge of the hood. I think we need to find out. That isn't what you said before. No. Walter looked at him. Before, I had a suspicion. He pointed toward the engine. Now I've heard it 3 times. Tyler moved closer. If compression is low, we're talking rings. Valves. Maybe head trouble. Maybe. Walter emphasized the word. He had seen too many people turn maybe into a repair bill. Evan climbed down. So you think the engine's worn out? I didn't say that either. Walter's answer came quickly. A weak or uneven cranking rhythm could have more than one cause. And even if one cylinder wasn't behaving like the others, that still didn't explain why. The sound was a clue, nothing more. Walter looked back at the exhaust. Something else bothered him. A diesel needed more than an engine that simply rotated. It needed the right conditions for combustion. Compression mattered. Fuel delivery mattered. Timing mattered. Temperature mattered. If one of those pieces was missing, cranking alone wouldn't bring the engine to life. Walter turned to Evan. When you parked it 6 months ago, why did you park it? Didn't need it anymore. Was it running normally? Mostly. Walter caught the word. Mostly? Evan thought. It had gotten harder to start. Tyler looked at him. You didn't tell me that. I didn't think it mattered. Once it started, it ran. Walter's expression changed. There it was. Not an answer. A second clue. Did it get harder all at once? No. Gradually. Cold mornings? At first. And later? Evan paused. Even when it was warm, Walter looked back toward the tractor. The failure hadn't necessarily begun yesterday. Yesterday might only have been the day the machine finally stopped hiding it. Tyler unfolded his arms. So what are you thinking? Walter didn't answer. Instead, he reached toward the engine and stopped before touching anything. Before we tear into it, I want to know whether we're chasing air, fuel, or something mechanical. Tyler nodded slowly. For the first time, he wasn't dismissing the old farmer's method. What test? Walter looked at him. First, we make the engine answer one question at a time. Evan glanced between them. And if you're right? Walter shook his head. Don't worry about me being right. He looked at the tractor. Worry about proving what it's telling us. Then Walter reached for his tools. The listening was over. Now the old man's suspicion had to survive a test. Walter didn't reach for a wrench. He picked up a piece of chalk on the side of an old cardboard box. He drew 4 marks. Tyler watched him. What are those? Beats. Walter tapped each mark. 1, 2, 3, 4. Then again. 1, 2, 3, 4. His finger hesitated over the 3rd mark. That's closer to what I'm hearing. Tyler looked at the tractor. You can tell compression from that? No. Walter's answer came immediately. You measure compression with a gauge. He dropped the chalk onto the bench. Your ears just tell you when the gauge might be worth picking up. Tyler's expression changed. That was different from what he'd assumed Walter was doing. No magic. No diagnosis through cast iron. Just a clue. Walter walked toward the exhaust stack. And there's something else. What? When Evan cranked it, what came out of there? Tyler looked at the stack. Nothing. Walter nodded. Exactly. Evan frowned. How does nothing tell us anything? Because an engine that won't start can fail in different ways. Walter pointed beneath the hood. A diesel needed several conditions to agree. Enough cranking speed. Enough compression. Fuel reaching the cylinders. Fuel arriving at the right time. If one disappeared, combustion disappeared with it. Smoke wouldn't diagnose the tractor by itself. Neither would the uneven rhythm. But Walter wasn't looking for one clue that explained everything. He was looking for clues that agreed. He raised 3 fingers. Strong crank. 1 finger lowered. Starting got worse, gradually. Another. Uneven rhythm. Then the last. And almost nothing from the exhaust. Tyler looked toward the fuel system. Fuel delivery? Maybe. Evan sighed. You say that a lot? Walter looked at him. It's cheaper than being wrong. They started with the simplest checks. Fuel in the tank. Yes. Fuel leaving the tank. Yes. No obvious restriction where they expected one. Tyler worked down the system while Walter watched. A few minutes later, Tyler wiped diesel from his fingers. Fuel's getting this far? Walter nodded. That proves it's here. He pointed deeper into the system. Not that it's getting there correctly. Tyler's attention sharpened. Fuel delivery. Injection timing. Compression. Perhaps more than one weakness. Evan looked between them. So which one is it? Walter glanced at the chalk marks. I don't know. Evan's shoulders dropped. Walter noticed. That's good. How? Because we haven't bought anything yet. Tyler smiled. Walter picked up the chalk again. Expensive troubleshooting starts when somebody replaces an answer before proving the question. He studied the tractor. The clues didn't fit neatly. The uneven cadence pulled him toward a mechanical imbalance. The lack of exhaust response pulled him toward combustion or fuel delivery. Walter distrusted neat conclusions when the evidence wasn't neat. So he chose the smallest test that could separate them. Tyler understood. If the response changes, we learn something. And if it doesn't, Walter tossed the chalk onto the bench. Then my idea loses. No hesitation. No pride. Just another possibility eliminated. Walter turned toward Evan. Get back in the seat. Then he moved beside Tyler. This time, they weren't going to listen to the diesel as one dead machine. They were going to make its systems answer separately. Evan placed his hand on the key. Walter leaned toward the engine. Not yet. Tyler leaned in beside him. For the first time that morning, the young mechanic wasn't waiting for Walter to tell him what was wrong. He was waiting to see whether Walter was wrong. And somewhere inside the old diesel, one of their assumptions was about to fail. Walter started with the fuel system, not because he was certain, because it was the easiest suspect to eliminate without opening the engine, Crank it. Evan turned the key. The starter pulled the diesel over. Ra-ra-ra-ra-ra. Tyler watched closely as Walter worked through the test. Then Walter raised his hand. Stop. They checked again. Fuel was moving, not merely reaching the tractor from the tank. The system was delivering fuel farther downstream than Walter's first suspicion had predicted. Tyler wiped his fingers on the rag. So it's getting fuel. Some fuel. Walter corrected. Enough to start? That's a different question. They repeated the procedure. Sama result. Walter stood still for several seconds. Tyler studied his face. That wasn't what you expected. No. Walter didn't try to hide it. His first theory had been that a restriction or delivery problem was starving the engine badly enough to explain the no-start condition. The evidence wasn't supporting that cleanly. Evan leaned over from the seat. So we're back where we started? Walter shook his head. No. Now there's one less place to waste money. To Walter, a failed hypothesis wasn't wasted time. It was a closed gate. He looked again at the exhaust. Something still didn't fit. Fuel was moving through the system, yet the engine gave almost no indication that combustion was trying to establish itself, and beneath everything remained that uneven, cranking cadence. Walter put his hand on the hood. Again. Tyler looked surprised. You want to hear it again? I want to hear it now that I know something I didn't know 10 minutes ago. That was the difference. The sound hadn't changed. Walter's understanding of it had. Evan cranked. Walter closed his eyes. Ra-ra-ra-ra. There. The irregularity returned. Repeating. Not random. Walter opened his eyes. Stop. He picked up the chalk and returned to the cardboard. 4 marks. He tapped them in sequence. 1. Tfo. 3. Fool. Then again. 1. Tfo. 3. His finger hesitated. Fool. Tyler moved beside him. You still think one cylinder isn't building the same resistance? I think one part of the cycle isn't behaving like the others. Compression. Could be. Volave. Could be. Rings? Walter looked at him. Could be. Tyler exhaled. You really don't like committing to an answer? Walter put down the chalk. I like committing after the machine does. Then Evan remembered something. There was a sound. Both men turned. When? Last fall? Before I parked it. What kind? Evan struggled to describe it. Not a knock. More like a little unevenness at idle. It would smooth out when I gave it throttle. Walter's attention sharpened. How long? Couple months. Maybe. And starting got worse around the same time? Evan thought. Yeah. Walter looked at Tyler. Now they had a timeline. The tractor hadn't simply died during 6 months of storage. It had been giving warnings before it was parked. Slightly uneven idle. Increasingly difficult starts. Now an uneven cranking cadence. Symptoms separated by months. Possibly connected by the same underlying problem. Tyler's expression changed. If we're losing compression on one cylinder, we prove it. This time Walter didn't say maybe. Not because he had decided the diagnosis. Because he had decided the next test. They brought out the equipment. The work became slower. Connections had to be correct. The engine had to be tested consistently. One reading alone would mean little without comparison. Walter watched Tyler handle the procedure. This was Tyler's territory now. Numbers. Measured evidence. The first result came in. Then another. Nothing dramatic. Evan watched from behind them. Well, keep going. Walter said. Another cylinder. Another reading. Then the next. Tyler stared at the gauge. Hereshatit. Do that one again. They repeated the test. The result returned. Tyler's face tightened. Evan stepped closer. What? Tyler didn't answer immediately. He looked at Walter. Walter wasn't smiling. He had heard an imbalance. Now the instrument was telling them that imbalance was real. One cylinder was behaving differently. But that created a more dangerous question. Why? Worn rings could do it. A valve problem could do it. Damage inside the cylinder could do it. Some possibilities meant a repair. Others could mean the tractor truly wasn't worth saving. Evan looked at the old machine. So Tyler was right? The engine's worn out? Walter shook his head. We haven't earned that conclusion yet. He stared at the numbers once more. Then at the engine. Compression tells us where the problem shows itself. Walter reached for a wrench. It doesn't tell us what's causing it. Tyler looked at him. What are you thinking? Walter's eyes moved toward the top of the engine. The sound wasn't telling us the answer. He paused. It was telling us which door to open. And now, for the first time that morning, they were going to open it. Walter didn't remove the cylinder head. Not yet. A low reading told them where the weakness appeared. Tearing the engine apart before understanding why would only destroy the evidence. He leaned over the old diesel and studied the top of the engine. Take the cover off. Tyler reached for his tools. A few minutes later, the valve train was exposed. Nothing looked catastrophic. No shattered metal. No broken component lying loose. No obvious failure, dramatic enough to explain why the tractor had become harder and harder to start. Evan looked disappointed. I thought we'd see something. Walter shook his head. Big failures are easy. He pointed into the engine. It's the small ones that get expensive when nobody notices them. Tyler slowly rotated the engine, while Walter watched the valve movement. One opened, closed. Another followed. Walter wasn't merely looking for movement. He was comparing movement, timing, travel, clearance, whether each part returned the way it should. Again. Tyler rotated it another cycle. Walter bent lower. Then he touched Tyler's shoulder. Stop there. He checked one position. Then motioned for Tyler to continue. Stop. Walter stared. Evan stepped closer. What is it? Don't know yet. Tyler almost laughed. But now? He expected that answer. Walter asked him to check the clearance. Tyler did. Then checked it again. His expression changed. That one's tight. Walter nodded. Too little valve clearance could matter enormously on a diesel. As components wore, shifted, or changed over years of service, a valve might no longer seat exactly as it should, and if a valve failed to close completely during the compression stroke, even by a small amount, pressure could escape. A diesel depended heavily on compression. Lose enough of it, and starting became difficult. Lose more, and eventually the cylinder might stop contributing during cranking altogether. Evan stared at the exposed mechanism. That little gap can keep the whole tractor from starting? Walter answered carefully. It can contribute to it. He refused to turn another clue into a miracle explanation. We still test. Tyler adjusted the clearance to specification. Then rotated the engine through another cycle. Everything moved. Everything returned. They rechecked it. Walter stepped back. Now crank it. Evan climbed onto the tractor. The engine was still not ready to run. They were testing the behavior first. He turned the key. R. Walter immediately raised his head. Tyler heard it too. Wait. Evan stopped. Tyler looked at Walter. That changed. Walter nodded. It hadn't become a healthy engine. It hadn't suddenly started. But the cadence was different. The weak beat Walter had been following was less pronounced. They repeated the compression check. The reading improved. Not perfectly, but enough. Enough to establish a connection between what Walter had heard and what they had found. Evan's face brightened. So that's it. Walter remained still. No. Evan's smile disappeared. No? If that were the whole problem, I'd expect more. Walter looked again toward the exhaust. They had found something real, but the tractor still wasn't starting. That meant the story inside the engine had another layer. Tyler understood before Evan did. We had two problems. Maybe. Tyler shook his head with a smile. There it is again. Walter ignored him. He asked Evan to crank once more. This time, Walter didn't concentrate on the uneven compression rhythm. That clue had already led them somewhere useful. He listened beyond it. The cadence was more even now, and because it was more even, something that had been buried beneath the imbalance became easier to notice. Or rather, easier to notice that it wasn't there. Walter opened his eyes. Stop. He walked toward the side of the engine where the mechanical fuel system sat. Tyler followed his gaze. What? Walter pointed. We've been listening to what the engine is doing. He paused. I want to know what it's not doing. Tyler looked toward the injection system. Then the meaning landed. The low compression had been real, but it might not have been the reason the entire engine refused to start. It had been noise hiding another signal. Walter rested 2 fingers against the housing. Thinking back to Evan's timeline, harder cold starts, then harder warm starts. Unil. Months of gradual decline. Storage. Now complete refusal. Not one sudden failure. A progression. Walter looked at Tyler. Before we open anything expensive, check the timing. Tyler stared at him for a moment. Then he reached for his tools. The first sound had revealed a weak cylinder. The second clue was stranger. Because this time, Walter wasn't chasing something he could hear. He was chasing something the old diesel should have been doing, but wasn't. Tyler reached toward the injection pump. Walter stopped him. Don't move anything. Tyler froze. You said check the timing. I said check it, not change it. That distinction mattered. If they loosened the pump and started adjusting blindly, they could make the tractor run differently without ever knowing whether timing had been the original problem. Walter wanted evidence first. They cleaned years of grime from the timing area until the reference marks became visible. Tyler rotated the engine carefully. Walter watched. Bring it around again. Tyler did. This time, slower. The marks approached their reference position. Walter leaned closer. Stop. Tyler looked. Then looked again. That doesn't seem right. Walter said nothing. He asked him to rotate the engine through another full cycle and repeat it. Same result. The relationship wasn't where Tyler expected it to be. Not wildly wrong. That was important. If the timing had shifted dramatically, the engine likely would have shown more obvious symptoms before it was parked. This was subtler. Enough to matter. Possibly enough to make a tired old diesel increasingly difficult to start. Tyler pointed at the marks. Pump timing's late. Looks that way. So we found it. Walter shook his head. We found another symptom. Tyler stood upright. What else do you want? Walter pointed toward the mechanism driving the pump. I want to know why it moved. That silenced him. Injection timing, on an old mechanical diesel, didn't normally decide one morning to become wrong for no reason. Something had changed. Where? Adjustment. A loose component. Movement somewhere in the drive. If they simply corrected the pump position without finding the cause, the tractor might start today and return with the same problem later. Walter had learned that lesson the expensive way. Fixing the position was not the same as fixing what changed the position. They followed the drive backward. Slowly. No guessing. Tyler checked the mounting. Secure. They inspected what they could reach without dismantling the front of the engine. Nothing obvious. Evan shifted impatiently behind them. How far are we going with this? Walter didn't look up. As far as the evidence goes? And if the timing drive is worn out, then we stop pretending this is a small repair. That was the first time Walter acknowledged the possibility plainly. The tractor might still have a serious internal problem. Sentiment didn't change mechanical reality. If the engine needed major work, Evan would eventually have to decide whether his father's tractor was worth the cost. But they weren't there yet. Tyler rotated the engine again. Walter watched the movement at the pump. Back up. Tyler reversed slightly. Forward. He moved it again. Walter's eyes narrowed. Do that again. Forward. Back. Forward. There was a tiny delay. The crankshaft moved before the pump drive responded. Tyler saw it now. Play. Walter nodded. Not enough to diagnose the entire system from sight, but enough to justify looking deeper. They removed only what was necessary to inspect the drive more closely. Minutes passed. Then Tyler stopped. Walter. He pointed. Wear was visible in part of the drive connection. Not catastrophic. Not broken. Worn. A small amount of lost motion had accumulated where there should have been a more precise transfer of movement. Evan stared at it. That little bit? Walter looked at him. Little things become big things when timing depends on them. The engine could still rotate normally. The starter could sound strong. Fuel could still exist in the lines. The pump could still function. Yet if injection occurred increasingly late relative to piston position, starting could become progressively more difficult, especially when combined with another weakness like the compression problem they had already uncovered. Tyler finally saw the larger picture. One problem was hiding the other. Walter nodded. The tractor hadn't necessarily suffered one dramatic failure. It had aged in layers. A valve no longer behaving perfectly. Wear introducing lost motion. Timing drifting away from where the engine wanted it. Each weakness alone might have been survivable. Together, they had eventually crossed a threshold. Evan looked toward the driver's seat. So if we correct this, it'll start? Walter picked up the worn component. Maybe. Tyler laughed. Walter looked at him. You want a guarantee? No. Tyler shook his head. I think I'm finally learning not to ask you for one. Walter placed the component on the workbench. They now had something they hadn't possessed that morning. Not a theory. Not Walter's ears. Physical evidence. And for the first time, Tyler understood why Walter had refused to let them tear the engine apart. If they had jumped straight to a rebuild because of the low compression reading, they might have spent thousands of dollars and left the second problem untouched. Walter looked at the old tractor. Now we repair what we've proved. Only after that would they turn the key again. And only then would they learn whether the old diesel had one more secret left to tell them. The worn piece on the workbench didn't look like something that could stop a tractor. No shattered teeth. No bent shaft. No dramatic break. Tyler held it beneath the shop light and turned it between his fingers. If somebody handed me this without telling me where it came from, I might have put it back in. Walter nodded. That's how machines get old. Tyler looked at him. Walter pointed toward the worn connection. Not always by breaking. He moved it slightly. Sometimes by losing a little bit of what used to be exact. That was what they had missed. The tractor's problems had never looked serious enough on their own. The starter turned strongly. Fuel moved through the system. The engine still had compression. The injection pump still worked. Nothing had completely failed. And yet the tractor wouldn't start. Because a diesel didn't need those things to merely exist. They had to agree. Compression had to be sufficient when the piston reached the right position. The valve had to seal when that compression was being built. Fuel had to arrive. And injection had to occur at the correct point in the cycle. The old tractor had been slowly losing that agreement. The tight valve clearance had weakened one cylinder's ability to hold compression. Wear in the injection drive had introduced a small amount of lost motion. That lost motion had allowed timing to drift. Neither problem had killed the engine by itself. Together, they had pushed it toward a line it could no longer cross. Evan stared at the worn part. So this is why it got harder to start? Walter didn't answer immediately. It fits. He pointed toward the tractor. Think about what you told us. At first, it had struggled only on cold mornings. Then it took longer even when warm. Later came the uneven idle. Evan had compensated without realizing it. Cranked longer. Used more throttle. Waited for the engine to smooth itself out. Every small change had become normal because the tractor still worked. Until it didn't. Tyler looked toward the open engine. We kept treating yesterday like the day it broke. Walter shook his head. Yesterday was just the day it ran out of margin. The shed became quiet. That was different. The tractor hadn't gone from healthy to dead in one morning. It had been declining while still doing its job. A little compression lost here. A little timing lost there. For months, the engine had tolerated both. Then one day the remaining margin wasn't enough. Tyler looked at Walter. But you didn't know any of this when you first heard it. No. You heard the weak cylinder. I heard something uneven. Walter pointed toward the compression gauge. That told us whether the sound meant anything. Then toward the valve train, the number told us where to look. And after we fixed the valve, it still didn't start. Walter nodded. That mattered too. Tyler understood. The failed start, after the valve adjustment, hadn't meant the repair was useless. It had proved the first fault was real but incomplete. One problem had been hiding another. Walter picked up the worn drive component. This is where people get expensive. Evan frowned. How? They find one real problem and stop thinking. Walter set the part down. A correct diagnosis can still be incomplete. Tyler stared at the tractor. That sentence landed harder than anything Walter had said all morning. They could have rebuilt the weak cylinder. They could have replaced parts in the fuel system. They could have moved the injection pump until the engine happened to run better. Any of those choices might have cost hundreds or thousands without explaining the whole failure. Instead, every repair they were about to make had evidence behind it. Walter looked at Tyler. Now we fix what we've proved. The work took most of the afternoon. The valve clearance was corrected and verified. The worn portion of the drive was repaired. The lost motion was checked again. Then Tyler returned the mechanical injection timing to its proper relationship. He checked the marks. Walter watched. Again. Tyler rotated the engine through another cycle. The marks returned. Good. Walter didn't move. Tu le sais. You want it again? Walter almost smiled. One more. They checked it a third time. Only then did Walter nod. Covers went back on. Lines were secured. Tools disappeared from the fenders. The fuel system was prepared. The battery was still strong. By the time they finished, late afternoon sunlight stretched across the floor of the shed. Evan climbed into the seat, then stopped. His hand hovered above the key. All day, they had been trying to reach this moment. Now none of them seemed eager to rush it. Evan looked down at Walter. You think it'll start? Walter studied the tractor. They had corrected what the evidence had shown them. That was all he could honestly say. A 40-year-old diesel could still be hiding where they hadn't found. Walter had learned long ago that a repair earned confidence only after the machine repeated the result. I think we've given it a fair chance. Tyler moved beside the engine. Walter stepped back toward the same doorway where he'd stood that morning. Listening, Evan wrapped his fingers around the key. Walter nodded. Try it. The starter engaged, and for the first time all day, they weren't listening for what was wrong. They were listening to hear whether the old diesel agreed with them. Evan turned the key. The starter engaged. Walter's head lifted immediately. The rhythm was different, more even. The hesitation he had heard that morning was almost gone. But the engine didn't start. Evan released the key. Nobody spoke. Tyler's face fell. After hours of work, that silence felt heavier than it had before. We changed the timing, fixed the valve clearance. Compression improved. Walter nodded. I know. So why isn't it firing? Walter walked toward the exhaust. Because fixing what was wrong doesn't guarantee we've restored everything it needs to start. Tyler stared at him. What are we missing? Walter didn't answer. He looked at the tractor as if the last attempt had given him another piece of information. Crank it again. Evan turned the key. Rrr. This time Walter watched the exhaust. A faint haze appeared, small enough that Evan almost missed it. Walter raised his hand. Stop. Tyler had seen it too. Now we're getting smoke. Walter nodded. That mattered. Earlier, the exhaust had given them almost nothing. Now there was at least evidence that fuel was reaching the cylinders during cranking. The repairs had changed the engine's behavior. They were closer, but close didn't start tractors. Walter placed a hand against the engine block. It was cool. The tractor had been sitting all day while they worked. An old diesel with years of wear could be far less forgiving when cold than when warm. Correct timing and improved compression had restored part of the conditions it needed. But Walter wasn't going to abuse the starter hoping persistence would solve the rest. He checked the starting system appropriate to the tractor. Then the fuel system was bled and verified once more. Tyler worked beside him without arguing now. The relationship between the two men had changed during the afternoon. That morning, Tyler had interpreted Walter's pauses as uncertainty. Now he understood them differently. Walter didn't rush past evidence. He waited until the machine gave him permission to move to the next step. Evan climbed down. What if it still doesn't start? Walter tightened the last connection. Then we keep diagnosing. And if the engine itself is simply too worn, then we say so. There was no sentimentality in his answer. Walter wanted the tractor to run, but wanting something wasn't evidence. He would not turn an old machine into a miracle simply because it belonged to Evan's father. Tyler checked the timing marks one final time. Still where we set them. Walter nodded. Valve? Correct. Fuel? Bled. Battery? Strong. Walter stood upright. Now the conditions were beginning to agree. That was what had been missing all along. Not one magical broken part. Agreement. Compression had to be sufficient. Valve operation had to be correct. Injection timing had to correspond with piston position. Fuel had to reach the cylinders. Cranking speed had to be adequate. An old diesel could tolerate some wear. What it could not tolerate forever was several small weaknesses accumulating in the same direction. Walter wiped his hands. Try it. Evan returned to the seat. Tyler stood near the engine. Walter stayed farther back. Evan turned the key. Ver-ra-ra. A faint puff rose from the exhaust. Then, hoo, be-yaddy-yaddy-yaddy. Evan's hand tightened around the key. Tyler looked sharply at Walter. One cylinder had fired. Not enough to carry the engine, but unmistakable. Keep it turning. Walter said, He-be-ahi-ahi, he-be-ahi-ahi. The exhaust began producing short pulses. The tractor shook once, then stopped trying. Evan released the key. His eyes were wide. You heard that? Walter almost smiled. Everybody heard that? For the first time all day, the old diesel had tried to live. Tyler stepped toward the engine. That's a completely different machine from this morning. No, Walter said. He looked at the faded hood. Same machine. He paused. We've just given it back some of what it lost. They waited before trying again. No endless cranking. No impatience. Walter wanted the starter protected and the battery strong for the attempt that mattered. 5 minutes later, Tyler finished the final checks. Evan climbed aboard again. The late afternoon sunlight had reached the floor of the shed. Walter stood where he had stood that morning, near the doorway, listening. Evan looked at him. Walter nodded once. The key turned. The starter engaged. Beahi-ahi, beahi-ahi. The engine stumbled. Caught. Lost it. Caught again. Then a deeper sound rolled through the shed. Bram, bram, bram. Evan released the key. The starter disengaged, but the crankshaft kept turning. The tractor was running. Tyler stepped backward as a dark puff left the exhaust and disappeared into the afternoon air. The old diesel shook on its mounts, rough for several seconds. Then the idle began to settle. Walter said nothing. He listened through every beat. The irregular rhythm that had stopped his finger that morning was gone. Evan laughed from the driver's seat. Tyler turned toward Walter, expecting triumph. There wasn't any. Walter simply watched the tractor idle. After nearly a minute, he finally spoke. Don't rev it. Evan took his hand away from the throttle. Walter stepped closer and listened again. Because getting an old engine to start was one thing. Proving they had actually repaired it was another stand. The old diesel had started. Walter still wasn't satisfied. Let it idle. Evan kept his hand away from the throttle. The engine rocked gently beneath the faded hood. Broom, 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 broom. Tyler stood beside Walter, listening. A few hours earlier, he would have considered the job finished the moment the engine fired. Now he understood why Walter didn't. Starting proved they had changed something. It didn't prove the repair would hold. Walter watched the exhaust. The dark burst from the initial start had faded. The engine still sounded rough from sitting. But as temperature came into the block, the idle began to settle. Walter placed his palm against the hood. Not to perform some mystical diagnosis, to feel. A regular vibration told him something different from a repeated stumble. 30 seconds passed. Then a minute. Bring it up a little. Evan eased the throttle forward. The engine climbed above idle. Walter listened. No sudden miss. No sharp mechanical knock. No obvious break in the cadence. Back down. Evan reduced the throttle. The diesel returned to idle without dying. Tyler smiled. That's a good sign. It's a sign. Walter said. Tyler laughed. You ever call anything good? When it earns it. Walter walked around the tractor. They checked for leaks around the areas they had disturbed. Fuel. Oil. Anything loose. Nothing obvious appeared. Then Walter did something Evan didn't expect. Shut it off. Evan stared down at him. You're kidding. Shut it off. We just got it running. Exactly. Evan looked almost offended. Walter pointed toward the ignition. If we're afraid to turn it off, we haven't fixed a tractor. We've created a demonstration. Tyler couldn't argue with that. Evan pulled the stop control. The diesel slowed. Brum. 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 Then silence. For several seconds, nobody moved. The machine shed suddenly seemed too quiet. Walter waited. A warm restart would tell them whether the engine could repeat what it had just done without the long struggle. 1 minute, he said. Evan remained in the seat. When Walter finally nodded, Evan turned the key. The starter barely completed 2 rotations. Rrrr, bram. The engine caught cleanly. Tyler looked at Walter. Walter was watching the exhaust. Again. Evan shut it down. This time Tyler didn't question him. They waited, then restarted it. Rrrr, bram. The tractor settled into idle. A worry. Evan's grin widened. That good enough for you? Walter finally allowed himself a small smile. Better. But there was one test left. An engine could sound healthy sitting in a shed and behave very differently once asked to work. They closed the hood. Tyler removed the tools from around the wheels. Evan backed the tractor slowly into the yard. For the first time in 6 months, the old machine moved under its own power. Walter watched from beside the shed. Evan drove toward an empty hay wagon parked near the fence. He backed beneath the tongue, connected it, then eased forward. The engine note changed immediately as the tractor accepted the load. Walter's attention sharpened. This was the sound he wanted, not the easy rhythm of an unloaded idle. The deeper exhaust note of an engine being asked to produce torque. Evan drove across the yard. The tractor pulled steadily. No hesitation. He turned at the far fence and came back. Tyler stood beside Walter. You knew it would run? Didn't you? No. But you thought it would. Walter glanced at him. Thinking and knowing are how people end up buying parts they don't need. Tyler smiled. The tractor approached the shed. Its diesel note echoed from the metal roof. This time, Walter didn't count with his fingers. He didn't need to. Evan stopped beside them and let the engine idle. For a moment, none of the 3 men spoke. That morning, the same sound had meant failure. Now every combustion stroke arrived where it belonged. Tyler looked at Walter. I've got to ask. Walter waited. When you first heard it this morning, did you know what was wrong? No. The answer came without hesitation. Tyler seemed surprised despite everything Walter had already told him. Then what did you know? Walter looked at the tractor. That everybody was asking why it wouldn't start. He listened to the steady idle. I thought we needed to ask why it didn't sound like an engine that could start. Tyler stared at him. That was the difference. Walter hadn't possessed the answer. He had found the right first question. Evan climbed down and stood beside the machine his father had once driven. He rested a hand on the worn fender. How long do you think it'll keep going? Walter looked at the tractor. There were still worn rings somewhere inside it. Old seals, bearings with thousands of hours behind them. Nothing they had done that day had made the machine young, and Walter wouldn't pretend otherwise. Depends how you treat it. Evan nodded. Walter turned to leave. Behind him, the tractor continued idling. Broom, 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 broom. Tyler listened differently now. Not for noise, for repetition. For variation. For the small deviations, that might mean something before a failure became obvious. Walter. The old farmer stopped. Tyler pointed toward the running tractor. How did you learn to hear that? Walter looked back. For the first time all day, the question wasn't about the machine. It was about him. And Walter knew the answer couldn't be found in any repair manual. Walter looked at Tyler. How many engines did you hear start this week? Tyler shrugged. 20? 30? And how many did you actually listen to? Tyler didn't answer. Walter nodded toward the tractor. That's how. The diesel idled behind them. Steady now. Walter had never deliberately trained his ears. There had been no lesson where someone taught him that one rhythm meant compression and another meant fuel. It had happened through repetition. For nearly 50 years, engines had been the background noise of his life. A tractor starting before sunrise, a combine working under full load, an irrigation pump running through the night, a diesel struggling on a freezing morning. Most of those sounds meant nothing at the time, but his mind had stored them. Thousands of examples of what normal sounded like. Tyler looked toward the tractor. So you compare what you're hearing now with everything you've heard before? Something like that? But you knew that crank was wrong almost immediately. Walter shook his head. I knew it was different. That distinction mattered. I didn't know why. Tyler glanced at the tools still spread across the bench. That morning, he had assumed Walter was doing something almost superstitious, an old farmer claiming he could hear a mechanical failure hidden inside an engine. But that wasn't what had happened. Walter heard an abnormal pattern. Then they tested compression. The test exposed a weak cylinder. Inspection led them to the valve condition. Correcting it changed the cranking rhythm, but didn't start the tractor. That failure forced them to look again. Then they found the timing, discrepancy, then the where behind it. No single sound had revealed all of that. The sound had only opened the first door. Tyler leaned against the workbench. In school, they taught us diagnostic trees. Walter nodded. Good way to work. Check the symptom. Run the test. Eliminate causes. Sounds familiar. Tyler smiled. I guess yours just starts before the test equipment comes out. Walter looked at him. Tools tell you things your senses never can. He pointed toward the compression gauge. I couldn't tell you that number by listening. Then toward the timing marks. Couldn't see those through the hood either. Walter wiped his hands. Experience doesn't replace instruments. He looked back at the tractor. It tells you which instrument might be worth picking up first. That was not the answer Tyler had expected. All morning, the situation had seemed ready-made for an argument between generations. Old farmer against young mechanic. Instinct against technology. But Walter refused the contest. He didn't distrust Tyler's tools. He depended on them to prove his suspicions, and Tyler was beginning to understand that modern diagnosis didn't make observation obsolete. The two methods worked best together. Evan shut the tractor down. The sudden silence caught Tyler's attention. Walter noticed. You heard that? Heard what? The way you listened when it stopped. Tyler smiled. Maybe you're rubbing off on me. Walter walked toward the tractor. Start it cold tomorrow morning. Evan nodded. If it struggles, don't keep grinding the starter. What do I do? Walter pointed at Tyler. Call him. Tyler laughed. Not you? Walter shook his head. He's the mechanic. There was no sarcasm in it. No victory. Tyler looked at the old farmer differently after that. Not as someone who had beaten him. As someone who had noticed something he had overlooked. Walter picked up the worn drive component from the bench and handed it to him. Keep that. Tyler turned it over in his palm. As a souvenir? As a reminder. Of what? Walter looked toward the tractor. That a machine can still work while it's becoming a machine that won't. Tyler's smile disappeared. He understood. The tractor hadn't failed in one moment. The symptoms had accumulated quietly. Harder cold starts. Then harder warm starts. Unil. Small losses of tolerance. Until one morning the engine crossed the line between difficult and impossible. The mistake was waiting for failure before paying attention. Tyler slipped the worn piece into his toolbox. The tractor had taught him something no scanner could have taught by itself. Not because scanners were inadequate, because a scanner could only help after someone knew what question to ask. Walter started walking toward his pickup. Tyler called after him. "One more question." Walter stopped. "If you had to teach somebody how to hear what you heard today, where would you start?" Walter thought for a moment. Then he pointed toward Evan's tractor. "Don't start with broken engines." Tyler frowned. "Start with the ones that run right." Walter opened his truck door. "Listen to enough of them." He climbed inside. "Then someday, when one changes." Walter looked at the worn piece in Tyler's hand. "You won't need somebody to tell you something changed." The pickup rolled out of the yard. Tyler remained beside the tractor. For the first time in his career, he wasn't thinking about what a broken engine sounded like. He was listening carefully to the machines that weren't broken yet. The next morning was colder. A thin layer of frost covered the grass behind Evan's barn, and the old tractor sat exactly where they had left it. This was the test Walter had wanted. Not another warm restart. Not an engine already carrying yesterday's heat. A cold machine after a full night of silence. Evan climbed into the seat. Tyler stood beside the shed. Walter wasn't there. That felt appropriate. Evan turned the key. The starter engaged. Rear brim. The diesel caught. A pale puff rose from the exhaust. The idle stumbled briefly, then settled into a steady rhythm. Tyler listened. Yesterday morning, that sound would have been nothing more than a tractor starting. Today he heard pieces inside it. The speed of the crank, the moment combustion caught, the spacing between the firing pulses, the way the idle stabilized. He wasn't Walter. He couldn't hear 50 years of experience overnight, but he had started paying attention. Evan let the tractor warm before driving toward the field. The machine moved slowly past the barn, morning sunlight catching scratches along its hood. It still looked old, because it was old. The repair hadn't erased 40 years of wear. It hadn't restored factory compression or made every bearing new. It hadn't turned the tractor into something it had never been. It had simply corrected enough of what time had slowly taken away. That distinction mattered. Old machines rarely fail because they suddenly become old. They age while they are still working. A little clearance changes. A little wear develops. A starting habit becomes slightly different. An engine takes 2 extra revolutions before catching. Then 4. A rough idle appears only when cold. The owner adapts, turns the key longer, adds throttle, waits another minute. What begins as a symptom becomes a routine, until one morning the routine stops working. That was what had happened to Evan's tractor. The machine had been telling its story for months. Nobody had realized it was a story. Walter had. Not because he possessed some forgotten mechanical secret, because he had spent most of his life noticing machines before they completely failed. At 73, Walter himself understood something about being mistaken for obsolete. The equipment around farming had changed enormously during his lifetime. Electronic controls could regulate engines more precisely than his hands ever could. Diagnostic equipment could measure things his ears could never identify. Modern tractors could report faults that machines from Walter's youth would have carried silently until somebody noticed a symptom. Walter didn't resent any of it. Progress wasn't the enemy. Forgetting how to observe was. That afternoon, Tyler found the worn drive piece Walter had given him. He cleaned the grease from it and placed it in the top drawer of his toolbox. Not because the part was rare, it wasn't. Not because Walter had performed some impossible repair. He hadn't. The object mattered because of what had happened before they found it. Everyone had been searching for a failed part. Walter had searched for a pattern. That pattern led to a measurement. The measurement led to the valve. Correcting the valve changed the symptom but didn't solve the failure. That forced another question. The next question led to timing. Timing led to where? Observation. Test. Evidence. Correction. Retest. There was nothing mystical about it. And that was precisely why Tyler remembered it. Months later, another old diesel came into his shop. Different manufacturer. Different engine. Different problem. The owner told Tyler what he had already replaced. Battery. Starter. Filters. Several other parts. Tyler listened politely. Then, before opening his toolbox, He asked the owner to do something. "Start it for me." The man turned the key. Tyler stood beside the engine. He didn't diagnose it immediately. He didn't pretend he could. He simply listened. Once, then again, he noticed something, and instead of deciding what it meant, he chose a test that could tell him whether his suspicion was wrong. That was the part of Walter's knowledge worth preserving, not the ability to know without measuring, the discipline to notice before measuring. Years of experience had not given Walter magical ears. They had given him a library of ordinary things. Healthy engines, normale vibration, proper rhythms, machines doing exactly what they were supposed to do. And because he knew ordinary so well, the unusual had somewhere to stand out. Back on Evan's farm, the old tractor continued working. It wasn't used every day. It didn't need to be. Some mornings it pulled a wagon. Some afternoons it ran an auger. And occasionally, Evan would stop beside it after shutting it down and remain there for a second longer than necessary. Listening as the final mechanical sounds faded, he understood now why Walter had stood silently at the barn door that first morning. Everyone else had looked at an old machine and seen what it could no longer do. Walter had listened for what it was still trying to say. Perhaps that was why the 73-year-old farmer and the 40-year-old tractor had understood each other so well. Both came from a time when usefulness wasn't measured by how new something was. It was measured by whether there was still work left inside it. And sometimes the difference between something being worthless and something being worth saving was simply whether anyone had enough patience to notice what everyone else had missed. The tractor had never been too old to speak. Everyone else had simply forgotten how to listen.